Hello, and welcome to another episode of Argus's Fertilizer Matters podcast. I'm Tom Hampson. I'm the Phosphates editor here at Argus. And I recently took part in a podcast with some of my colleagues here in London with me, where we talked about the phosphates, NPK and sulfur markets during and after the annual EFA conference, which took place around the end of June. One of the things that was missing during the EFA conference was strong buying from Brazil, given this is seasonally the last opportunity, a big time for Brazilians to buy phosphates for the upcoming season. And in several of my meetings, the question, what's going on in Brazil, came up. So, to help to answer that question, I am delighted to be joined by Bruno Castro, who reports on the Brazilian market based in Sao Paulo. Hello, Bruno. How are you?
Hello, Tom. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and dive into what's happening in Brazil right now.
Well, thanks very much for joining. To start us off, would you be able to give us just a brief introduction to the Brazilian phosphates market? What are the products, key seasons, crops?
Of course, Brazil is a major grain producer with a production estimated at over 360 million tons for the 2025-26 cycle, notably corn, soybean, and cotton crops. And soybean crops account for the largest share of phosphate demand in Brazil. The buying season runs from late February to late June, preceding the plant that begins in September in May-producing regions. In recent years, farmers were faced with higher prices of MAP, which is the traditional source of phosphate to Brazilian crops, and they have turned to other phosphate fertilizers such as TSP, SSP, and NPS to secure supply. This season, however, they were faced with higher prices for several phosphate fertilizers as the conflict in the Middle East drove up the cost of raw materials, including sulfur and ammonia.
Yeah, raw materials has been a really key issue, sulfur in particular. And as you said, we're in the build-up to soybean applications. The key time in Brazilian phosphates calendar for buying has been, or we're at the end of it now. There's a lot of talk of high prices causing demand destruction globally. How is the domestic market looking in Brazil?
Well, fertilizer deals in the Brazilian market continue on the sidelines, despite the approaching of the next soybean season, whose planting starting mid-September. Production costs for soybean crops increased in June in central western Mato Grosso state, which is the main soybean producer in Brazil, mostly because of higher fertilizer costs, which demotivates farmers to intensify purchases. But market participants report that there are phosphate volumes available for prompt delivery in the Brazilian domestic market.
And then sticking with buyers' actions, there's been updates on US producer Mosaic further cutting back its production, both in the US and at facilities in Brazil. Could you talk us through the cuts that are happening in Brazil and how are Brazilian buyers responding to the news?
Yes, well, faced with lower sulfur supply and rising prices, Mosaic revised its operational plan for the second half of 2026 and adjusted production at its facilities in Brazil, but the scale of the reduction was not disclosed. The reaction from the Brazilian market wasn't as strong since buyers are now starting to focus on nitrogen volumes for the next winter corn crop. Domestic market prices for SSP have retreated after peaking in mid-April.
You may have slightly answered my next one as well, given the, as you say, the shift to nitrates, but also perhaps to impact Brazil is that the US suspended the countervailing duties on imports of phosphates from Morocco into the US. So this reopens the US market to Morocco's OCP, giving OCP another option away from Brazil. Now, currently US DAP and MAP barge prices aren't attractive, but TSP is, and we have seen TSP prices lift a little bit in Brazil, first time in a while. Does the news about the duties worry any people in Brazil?
Well, Brazil has already passed the peak of its buying season and prices remain above buyers' expectations. So I believe Brazilian buying interest would increase if there were any further changes in the global market fundamentals. But do you see any changes in the global picture, Tom?
Yes, I should probably give a round up a bit on what's happening on the global market. So back at EFA, as I mentioned, there was a lot of demand destruction globally caused by high prices and buyers in many markets pushing back on prices. So we saw a slight softening in global prices back around EFA at the start of this month. But then the Indian phosphoric acid contract price settled higher. It's now at $1,700 a ton P2O5 CFR India for the third quarter. And that was driven by higher sulfur prices and also a greater availability of ammonia, therefore a bit more demand for acid in India. And that cut short the softer sentiment a little bit. And now since then, we've had a re-escalation of conflict and tensions between the US and Iran in the Mideast Gulf. That again supports sulfur prices and freight costs as well. So that supports production costs for phosphates and stops the suppliers from dropping their offers, puts a limit to how much weight the buy side can put on these phosphates prices. And now suppliers globally are really turning their attentions to the east, to India in particular, because Indian imports have been pretty low compared to previous years so far. And India is expected to issue another substantial tender for DAP to buy some TSP as well. And that's coming. And so suppliers, traders are anticipating higher prices to India. From what we understand, India is probably targeting a similar price to under its last significant tender, where it's awarded prices at 930, 935 CFR range. But offers are now being circulated for DAP to India at 950 CFR plus. Also to watch, or demand also to come, another subsidized market as well is Bangladesh. Bangladesh will typically issue private sector tenders, and it hasn't yet this year, and so it's expected to come with a tender, so with some demand. Normally it would buy DAP from China, but China so far continues to prioritize its domestic market and isn't offering for the export market. Ethiopia should also have some more demand, or we understand there is some more demand for DAP in Ethiopia. And a little bit further down the line in terms of seasonality, Australia would normally take a lot from China. It has been taking a lot from Saudi Arabia, from Morocco. Saudi Arabia is exporting from the Red Sea now, not out of Ras Al Khair in the Mideast Gulf, but is that competitive? Is that a freight that can work to Australia? So for that market, that season is typically around the first quarter. So there is, in the Eastern Hemisphere, there is expected demand, and that's gathering, that's stealing a lot of the attention of the suppliers. But there is a question, a lot of these markets are wondering, the Western markets, they've been very quiet so far. As I mentioned, US barge prices have been low compared to global prices, so not attracting imports. But there is the question of what demand, what competition there will be. And so therefore, Bruno, I'm going to turn it back on you one last time. Hopefully we've gone some way to answer that question at the top, what's going on in Brazil. But I'm going to ask you what I suspect is the real question behind that question, which is, should we expect a last-minute surge in import buying from Brazil? Or in other words, should other markets be ready for some competition from Brazil?
Well, market participants estimate that 20 to 30% of the expected demand for the next soybean cycle will not be traded, as prices are still exceeding buyers' expectation, and access to farmers' credit in Brazil is still a relevant issue. So we could see increased buying interest if prices pull back. However, this is unlikely to happen as long as production costs for suppliers do not also fall. And as you said, we have Indian demand to support levels from now on. Then in the current scenario, we should not see a last minute surge in Brazilian imports.
Thank you very much. So we'll watch this space. Let's see how it plays out. After that, listeners will be inconsolable to hear that you are actually moving on from reporting on fertilizers to report on agriculture, Bruno. And our loss is very much agriculture's gain. You will be missed. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining me, Bruno, and for all your insights.
Thanks a lot, Tom. This was a great conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. And of course, thank you to all the listeners for listening. Don't forget to look out for the next episode of Fertilizer Matters. Until then, from me, Tom Hampson, and from Bruno Castro, goodbye.